Well, good evening, gentlemen. I'm happy to be with you again for our holy hour to speak. And Kevin asked me if I would address the group this evening, and he gave me the topic. So he said, would you please talk about how to be a Christian witness in today's world? So the topic is actually very straightforward and very easy. How do you be a Christian witness in today's world? Well, you go out into the world and you witness to Christ. And I could end the talk right there, and Freddie would say that's the shortest talk I've ever given in my life. But obviously we know that a lot more needs to be said. We need to unpack it, specifically to say what does it mean to witness to Christ in the world, and how do we go about it effectively? There are a lot of good and bad ways to witness to the Lord. Some that will work to bring people in, some that take a little risk, and some that would just turn people away. And we certainly want to avoid things like that. So the question to ask ourselves is, we all are here, I'm sure we all want to witness to Christ in the world, in our lives and everything we do, and it can be frustrating when we're trying our best and it's not working. Well, what can we do to maximize it? First of all, I think we need to know the target audience. We need to know who we're talking to and what is their situation. Now, that will be especially true in the second section of what I want to talk about, but there's two different ways I want to discuss witnessing to Christ in the world today. One, on the general level, as a Christian community, the do's and don'ts, the good things that would work with that. And then on the one-on-one, where we might be in a situation where we're sitting down talking to somebody, which is one where that's really where everything comes into play, of just what to say to that person in that moment. On the general scale, first of all, I think in order to be a Christian witness as a church in the world, we have to be obviously living Christ. No question about that. The best model for us is looking at the original Christian community, the apostles and the immediate followers of them. When you look at what they did, here you had 12 men who were just filled with the Holy Spirit and ran out in the street. No script, no game plan. They had no modern media, nothing like we have today. All they did was go out and talk about Jesus to whomever would listen. And they won many people over. That very first day, 3,000 people were converted and believed in him. Now, granted, they had the benefit in Jerusalem of many of them having encountered Jesus. They heard him speak, they saw the miracles he performed, and knew that these apostles had claimed to have seen Jesus risen from the dead. But as they got further from that, they went into foreign countries and ultimately even to Rome itself, where nobody had seen or heard of Jesus, and they were trying to bring people to Christianity in a world that was flooded with so many other religions. Rome, as an empire, was very tolerant of religions. They had room for another god on another shelf somewhere. They had these Eastern religions coming in almost constantly, a flood of them from the eastern parts of the empire, especially through the military. And people would worship a whole variety of religions. The only one that the Romans were insistent upon, you can worship whomever you want, but also worship the gods of Rome or the emperor himself, as eventually, starting with Caligula and some of the others, started seeing themselves as a god incarnate. And most people basically just gave in to him. They said, fine, it wasn't serious enough. Fine, he wants me to think he's a god. Fine, I'll do it. Many of the people, the gods of Rome, were even losing their power by then. But all the different religions that came in, Christianity was the only one that was persecuted. And the reason for that was that Christians demanded that they worship the God of the Christians and no other God, trying to tell people you've got to abandon all those gods, not worship our God in addition to all of them, but they're all fake. Our God is the real God. And of course, that led to a lot of persecution. Yet we know that in the course of it all, it was that persecution that made the faith thrive. One of the great fathers of the church said, the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the faith. It's reported that one of the ancient Roman emperors had said, for every Christian he put to death in an arena, 2 pagans went out converted. And you wonder, in a world that was so tolerant of any other religion, why did Christianity catch on, especially when it was so persecuted? And there are many different things that we could point on to, but just to highlight them. First and foremost, of course, the person of Jesus and his message. There's no question about that. In fact, something that hit the ancient Roman world by storm about Christianity that was different from all the other religions was a prayer you and I say every day and probably don't even think much about. And that is the Lord's Prayer. Now, we call it the Our Father. Right? In in English, our Father, Latin Pater Noster, well, it doesn't strike us as much. But if you look at the Hebrew word that Jesus used, was Abba, literally means daddy. So Jesus, in teaching his followers, when you pray, say daddy, babo in heaven, or whatever words of endearment. Like a little child, you imagine a little girl whose father comes home to work and she said from her work, and she goes, daddy, and goes running in his arms. That was the relationship that Jesus taught his followers to have with God. The ancient Romans, all the other religions, they lived in fear of their gods. They worshiped the gods for fear. If I didn't worship Saturn or Neptune today, he might strike me. And anytime something bad happened, they thought it was the anger of the gods, which is one of the things that led to a lot of the Christians being persecuted. If there's a flood, if there's a drought, if there's an earthquake, the cry is the same, the Christian to the lions, because they thought the angry gods were getting back at them because the Christians were not worshiping. So in the midst of all that, you had these people with fearful gods, and not one of them taught that this God loved you enough to take on our human nature, and he took on our nature so we could take on his. The whole concept that we almost never hear about in our faith today, and we need to rediscover, divination or deification, becoming God, that God has allowed us to come into union with him. When the ancient Christian world heard that, first of all, that was radical. That was a breath of fresh air for people. Here was a loving God, not an angry God that they had to appease, but a loving God who cared about them. Secondly, the close-knit Christian community, the way the Christians lived together and cared for each other. They were devoted to it, and they were not only their own people, how well they took care of them, but even pagans and outsiders. The Christians had the first known Meals on Wheels program, where they were giving meals to widows and orphans and other people that the Roman emperors had said, they put us to shame. We should be providing these services, and we're not doing it. Wow. So that attracted them. The moral teachings of the church, especially when you realize, for example, St. Paul teaching that when he went into Corinth, for example, Corinth was the Sodom and Gomorrah of the Greek world. It was the filth pot. Anything filthy, ugly, sexually disgusting that you wanted to find, you found it in Corinth. And he probably should have walked the other way. He actually created one of the strongest communities in Corinth. Why? My guess is that because there were a lot of decent people living in Corinth who did not like the filth around them. And there was temple prostitution and all sorts of other things where people had brought sexual misconduct into part of their worship. And deep down inside many people, there's a sense, you know what? Isn't there anything that gives us something that makes us feel better about ourselves? This was bringing them down. And when Christianity came in with the call to morality, to being faithful to your spouse, people said, finally, something that lifts me up and gives me dignity. Many, many different things we could point to. But the fact was that the ancient Christians lived their faith seriously each and every day. And they even noticed after the persecutions. Some of the Christians, there was one of the persecutions where it was ended very suddenly because a plague broke out. And many of the people were dying, and now the emperor who had called for the persecution thought the God of the Christians was getting angry at them, so he called for an end to it. And many of the Christians went out and ministered to the very people who had been persecuting them. And that love of their enemies that Christ talked about took the world by storm. And ultimately we discover this is how an empire which unleashed all of its energy to try to destroy Christianity not only failed to destroy it, but eventually embraced it as its official religion. Unheard of. And a good portion of it, of course, the truth of Christ that they taught, and they lived it faithfully. And so on the general level, if we live out our faith each and every day, as a church, we need to be a people committed to Christ and the fidelity to his message. So one of the biggest mistakes I've seen made in past years, especially ever since the hippie generation and the sexual liberation and all that came along, is people dumbing down the message. Bishop Barron is very big on saying this, and every time he tells it at a talk somewhere, they cheer him. He says, don't dumb down the message. People are not going to be saved by marshmallows, by Barney theology, by all the sweet talk that sometimes they need the real meat and potatoes of solid gospel teachings, the radical change that far too often people have tried to bring people into the church by letting them believe whatever they want, just believe it with us. And that works with disgruntled people. So some of our mainline Protestant brothers and sisters, the churches will do that. When people don't like that the Catholic Church teaches this is a sin, and they decide, oh, I can't stand the church anymore because they teach that, they say, well, come and join us. We'll allow you to believe that here. And so they bring in disgruntled Catholics, but they don't have enough to sustain their children and other people. They're not giving them the solid meat and potatoes of the gospel. They're making them feel good in what they want to believe, but it's just patronizing. It's not really enforcing them in the gospel, and that's why they're dying. And sometimes you get the impression that they're just hoping that people will come to believe whatever they want just so that they can give them financial support to keep the doors open. So the first thing is don't dumb down the message. Don't just give people platitudes, rainbows and balloons. Give them the gospel of Jesus. And we realize when we look at it, some people will try to deny it, but there's no getting around. When you read the scriptures, Jesus was very challenging. He said to the rich young man, "What good master, what must I do to attain eternal life?" Now, obviously, here's a man who wanted heaven, and here's a man who called Jesus good. He knew he was good, and he hungered for what Jesus wanted. And he told him, "Sell everything you have and give it to the poor and follow me." And with that, the man's face fell and he went away sad. What did Jesus say? "Oh, I was only kidding. I don't mean that." No, he let him walk and just said how hard it is for the rich to enter the kingdom of God, because the man could not let go of his possessions. And the riches that keep us from Christ can be financial things. They can be our possessions. Oh, I can't give up my car or my big house or whatever. It can be the personal riches of our ideology, of our beliefs, of our practices, of our behaviors, of our entertainment. Anything that would keep us from following Jesus. Well, the Lord challenges us. He challenged people over and over again. And if we're going to bring people to the authentic Christ, then we also have to challenge them. Charitably, yes, with as much charity as we can. We don't want to bash them over the head. But we do nobody any good by pretending that there's nothing wrong with them, any more than somebody who's got cancer goes to a doctor and the doctor just says, "Oh, no, you're okay, here," gives them a hug and says, "Oh, there's no problem with you." No, unless we address the illness. And it's not, I'm sure a doctor, the hardest thing to tell a patient who comes in and sits before him is, "You've got cancer." I'm sure the doctor would love to be able to say to the person, "There's nothing wrong with you." But he has to tell them the truth, even if the person doesn't want to hear it. So number one, don't dumb down the message. Don't tell people the platitudes, because you know what? It's not working. We've been doing that for 50 years. And if that should work, we should be packed to the gills, because parishes all over the place, there are many places that are doing precisely that. Not talking about anything controversial, not challenging people, just making people feel welcome and comfortable and loved, as you hear so often from people. Why are those churches not packed? Because people see deep down, they know it's not working. It's not feeding what's really there. It's not nourishing their real need. And we have to be faithful. Faithful to the point of being bold. Not being apologetic for our Catholic faith, as sometimes we end up being today, but being proud of it. Going out and defending what we believe in and not apologizing, as we're trying to do. We've seen a few things in the news, as we're doing locally here, trying to fight. We're probably not going to succeed Tuesday in getting them to cancel the Drag Queen Story Hour down at the library. But just to let them know we're against it, and we're not just going to sit back and say, live and let live, if that's what they believe. No, this is a violation of our children's rights not to be indoctrinated at a young age into something that keeps them from Christ, and we're willing to take the abuse from it. And we know we're going to get it. When I posted it on, when I sent Flocknote out and put it on other things, I knew there would be some people that wouldn't like it, and sure enough, there were some who didn't. Many who did defend, many people who said, "Thank you, Father." There's a bishop now up in Rhode Island who this month, with Pride Month going on, was very bold and said no Catholic can take place in anything, in any pride activities. There is no pride in sin. And he's taking a lot of abuse for that, but he had to teach the truth. Bishop out in Illinois, Springfield, the Bishop of Springfield, who just recently, because Illinois is passing one of those liberal abortion laws, he says any politician who supported that and did it must refrain from communion. Made a bold statement, knowing he would get criticism. Sometimes we just have to be bold and preach Christ. And hopefully some people will listen. And even if we know it's going to turn people away, well, we can't bring them to a lie. We can only bring them to the truth. And Christ, when he talked about the Eucharist at the synagogue in Capernaum, unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you have no life within you, many people left. And how did he respond? Did he say, oh, all right, you don't like that? Come back, I'll change it, all right. You don't want this Eucharist thing? All right, just as long as you stay with me. No. With a heavy heart, he let them go. They were not ready to follow him. So, we need to be faithful to Christ. Charitable, loving, outreach, our social outreach to people. So many people have come to accept the truth of the faith because they saw the loving actions of Christians. I'm very happy to see all the different charitable things we do. The food pantry in the Bronx that we support, that basket or the box in the back is always overflowing with food. Every time we have a charitable cause here, the money flows in. People are willing to give a lot of money, even time. Our young adults, for example, taking part in POTS, part of the solution, which is a food pantry here in Westchester. And people doing things such as that, putting their faith in action, helping people, whether or not they're believers, no matter what it may be, and taking care of people even who might be sinners, and not rejecting people because of that. For example, back when the AIDS crisis broke in the 80s, nobody was more strong in defending or condemning homosexual acts as sinful, which back in the beginning, that's what was leading to the AIDS outbreak, was homosexual acts. Nobody was stronger in condemning homosexual acts as sinful, yet at the same time, nobody operated more beds for AIDS patients than the Catholic Church. So trying to get our world to understand again today, we hate the sin but love the sinner. And not branding people. And I try to tell people, if they're afraid to come in the door to ask me for help or something, I said, I never stop people at the door and say, do you go to church on Sunday? Are you on the registry? Anybody who needs help, we come in and talk with them. And it's a hope that maybe in time we will make a difference in their life. I remember specifically when I was in one parish, we had this elderly couple, and they kept coming to us for financial assistance. And we sent a group out to check on it. And when they came back, they said, it's deplorable, the conditions these people are living in. They were raising about 5 or 6 of their grandchildren because their children were, whatever their reason was, they basically were just popping out kids and shipping them to the grandparents to raise them. And they went in the house and they didn't even have beds. They had mattresses on the floor with old ripped blankets on top of them. They had practically nothing. And so we helped them. We did everything we can, not only through our own parish ministry, but we connected them with social services that could help, making sure that we're getting everything that the government had for them. And they weren't Catholic, this couple. Somehow they ended up at our doorstep. I don't know how they ended up with us, but they did. And eventually the man said, Father, I want to become Catholic because I've seen what you people have done, he says, and you obviously are speaking Christ. You are living the faith. In other words, we're not just talking about it, we're doing it. To borrow the old cliche, you're not just talking the talk, you're walking the walk. We have to do that. We have to be faithful witnesses of Christ in the world in order for people to follow us. And some will, others will not. There will always be people who, no matter how good we try to be, they will still reject us. Well, they rejected Jesus. So never be upset if we're doing our best and people are not following. Sometimes even faithful people who come to church every Sunday who just won't make the step to the further part of the journey, to the next step to really live Christ each and every day. And there are some people that are very happy to say, I just want to come to Mass on Sunday and get it over with until next week. And it's frustrating, to be honest with you, very frustrating because you want people to fall in love with Christ and see what they're missing. But some people just resist that. So on the one hand, we have the church at large, what we do as a institution. And of course, I think one of the things that we're starting to do now, which is eventually will be a boon for us, even though right now it's very painful, is acknowledging the weaknesses of how we dealt with the sexual misconduct in the clergy, most especially among the bishops. That they're finally coming to the point of realizing, all right, we got to stop defending ourselves and just start standing there and making a public apology and maybe doing public penance and saying, people, forgive us, we have sinned. We did not protect our children when we should have done so. So people will be angry angry for now, but if we follow through as we're doing, eventually I think people will see, all right, we took serious responsibility for our sins. And if we do that as a church, we will continue, as we have survived so many horrible things over the course of 2,000 years, that this is like a ripple on the surface compared to some of the tidal waves that we can see if we read history books. So not to make light, of course, for a moment. I don't want to sound for a moment like I'm making light of the abuse problem in the church that we've had in past years. But if we read history books, we see there were far more serious things that the church survived in other time frames. So that's the general one. The other one I want to talk about is the one-on-one. And that's where things get very subjective, because you may have somebody before you and you don't know why they don't follow the Lord. And before we can do anything for them, we have to know what their reason is. There is no one answer. Just like somebody coming into the doctor can't have one prescription for every patient who comes in. He has to sit down with each person and figure out where that person is. Some people fit into categories. Many people who don't worship, well, their parents never took them to Mass. Maybe, if they had them baptized, maybe they took them for Christmas and Easter, and sometimes today, even that, they're not even bringing them for Christmas and Easter anymore. They get baptized, and we never see them, and so they were never taught by their parents to have faith, and through no fault of their own, they just never met anybody that brought them to Christ. Those might sometimes be the easiest people to bring to the Lord, because they don't have any baggage. They don't have any hurts. They don't have any things they're holding on to that make them hesitant. They just never knew it. And a lot of times we'll discover many of the young people that are coming into the RCIA have been brought in because they met a boyfriend or girlfriend or fiance, married them, and this person was a faithful Catholic and the other person had known nothing about faith. And they start understanding it and they're very open to it. So, if we have somebody in that situation that has never known faith at all, well, they might be the easy ones. The other big group out there is a growing group today, and that's what we call the nones, N-O-N-E-S. People with no religious affiliation whatsoever. It's the largest single growing religious denomination in America. People with no religious affiliation at all. Whether it's people who have left their particular religion, not just denominations of Christianity, but Jews and others are having the same thing, or never had it in the first place, but it's a large growing group of people who do not connect with any organized religion. Ironically, it doesn't mean they don't believe in God. Studies show that greater than 90% of Americans believe God exists, and 80% of them would say they are spiritual. You see that a lot with the young people. I come upon that frequently. I remember just a year ago doing a wedding, and I was sitting down with two young people, one who had been a child I had taught, and another one was a cousin of theirs who didn't really have much faith background. And they're both saying, well, I'm very spiritual. I believe in God, and he's not just a figure out there. They want a relationship with him, but they don't see any reason to come to church and have that connection with him. Those are the ones where we have to figure out why, what went wrong. And different people, there's different ways to relate to them on that. One of the examples I would use with them, as I told them, I said, well, I'm spiritual, but I'm not very religious. I said, well, actually you are. I said, because religious means, by nature, the word religion means my response to God. So if you're even responding to God, you have religion. And they say, okay, but I can pray on my own. I don't need to go to church on Sunday and do that. Well, the first question I ask, quite frankly, is, do you in fact pray every day? On Sunday, if you say, I don't have to go to church, do you actually sit down for an hour and read the Bible or something like that? Is it a cop-out, or is it a faith that hasn't grown? In one person, it'll be different from another. So, and of course we have to be very careful in using it that way, because one person might accept it very well. You might be able to have the relationship with the person who will say to you, yeah, you're right. I'm using it as a cop-out. And somebody else, it might just shut them down. So you have to be very careful about how we say things to people and go through what they say. So what I did with this young man is he was saying, well, yeah, I'm spiritual. I believe in God, but I don't think I need to go to any organized religion and find rules. I said, so you can make it up for yourself. Oh, yeah. I said, okay. I said, suppose you decide you want to play golf. You see friends play golf and they enjoy it. What would you do? He says, well, probably go for golf lessons. I said, well, why? Why would you go for golf lessons? Why don't you just go and pick up the club and hit it for yourself until you figure out how it works. He goes, well, you have to go through a lot of trial and error before you get it right. And so you go to a pro who teaches you, and he's already been through all of that, so you can skip all that and get right to the right stuff. I said, exactly. And that's what the church is. You don't have to go back to square one and ask yourself, how can I prove the existence of God? You can skip right on that with 2,000 years of the Lord guiding the church through the power of the Holy Spirit and the great saints and the minds of the church that the Lord promised through St. Peter and his successor that he would teach the truth, that you have it right there. You can avoid all of that other stuff and going through it yourself. Why would you do that? If you wouldn't do that with golf or anything else, why would you do it with religion? Think that God has to be figured out on your own. No, go to the people who have had the experience, who have thought these things before you and fought the battles, and let them teach you so that you are at their level, and then you can go from there. And that young man said, he says, oh, that made a lot of sense. And he says, he goes, maybe I'll keep in touch with you. I gave him my email address. He never kept in touch with me, but hopefully I gave him food for thought. And next time I see some members of his family, I'm going to ask them, hey, did that guy ever make any changes with that? So sometimes people just have never really thought it through. Other people have been fed a whole bunch of lies. And what we have to do is just try to politely convince them that that what they believe is just wrong. For example, one of the biggest obstacles to young people today is that they somehow believe that faith and science are automatically at conflict with each other, that faith is unreasonable, that if you have faith, you can't have science, and vice versa. That is not our Catholic position, and yet people say that to us. And the answer to dispel that is very easy. Who created all the greatest colleges in the world? Who started the modern university system? The Catholic Church. Some of our great saints, maybe some of our greatest popes were all scientists by their degrees. Many of the things that we know were taught by priests and others. Copernicus, for example, was a good, faithful Catholic priest. There were many others. The man who gave us the name, the Big Bang Theory for creation, was a Belgian priest. Ironically, he came up with the idea. Somebody mocking him used the term Big Bang, saying, oh, that's ridiculous. And then somehow it turned around to be used as the definition that somehow was meant to deny the Catholic belief in creation, which is ludicrous. And we tell them, when kids say that, well, how can the Big Bang and creation go along together? I said, fine, easily. Let's say for a moment that the Big Bang Theory is exactly correct the way it is. All you've discovered is how God created. And I give the kids this example. I said, imagine you meet somebody that lived in the Amazon, and some tribe out there that has never had any contact with our world. And he's a friendly person, comes and lives with you in your house, and it's your birthday. And you serve him a piece of chocolate cake, and he tastes it and loves it. He goes, oh, this is great. And he's very questioning. He's an intuitive person. And he says, I want to figure out how this is made. And rather than asking you, he does his own little experiments and says, I figured it out. A whole bunch of ingredients, stuff such as chocolate and sugar and wheat and yeast and oil and a bunch of other things, eggs, all got mixed together into something we call batter. And it got heated at 375 degrees, or whatever the proper heat is, for 35 minutes. And then when it cooled down, this oozy thing got put on top of it that you call icing. And that's how this cake came to be. Is he right? And they all said, yeah. Said, I have therefore just come to prove there's no such thing as a baker. Does that make any sense? Figuring out how something was made does not prove that no one made it. In fact, if anything, it gives more support to the fact that somebody had to guide it. So just some of the logical things that kids don't think. They think somehow the Big Bang Theory disproves God. No, it doesn't. The science versus religion problem is a problem for only two groups of people, the two extremes. The religious fundamentalists, born-again Christians who believe the Bible is the Bible and every word for all of life is in there and nothing outside of it, which we as Catholics patently reject, or atheistic scientists who believe, no, everything is science and everything is by accident and there's no such thing as a God and they're out to prove otherwise. The two extremes have a problem. Everyone in between, we have no problem whatsoever reconciling religion and science. In fact, we say quite the opposite. The more we learn about the world God made, the more we learn about the love of God who made this world for us. How can it be that learning about the things of God's creation will prove he doesn't exist? It's quite the opposite. If anything, we can use science to show people how much God loves us. And looking at just the simplest of things. You look at sometimes some of the stuff that happens in our own human body. Some of the organs and the things that have to work just the right way. The pancreas, it has to fulfill its function just the way it does, or else we'd be sick. Things in the eye and the other things. If that doesn't happen perfectly, you don't think God cared about this and did it deliberately to help us? And I think the more that we learn about the world, the more we realize God's love for us, because this whole world was been given here to serve us. That we are stewards of the world so that it is serving our needs. And as amazing, as fascinating of all the different things in the world, whether it be astronomers finding foreign stars and galaxies and black holes and all the stuff they find out there saying, isn't that fantastic? Or deep sea divers, when you see them coming back with visions of animals we've never seen in the depths of the ocean, very bizarre things. I said, and yet God created all of those just so that we could marvel at him. So science should never be an obstacle to people following God. So if we can get young people in an honest conversation and get them to realize these things are false, well, then it will be easier for us to bring them around. Other things, it's a matter of educating what we believe in. A good number of people today reject the church because of our stand on gay rights. Because it's become very popular now. Everybody's gotten on the, defending the gay rights bandwagon. And because we still hold that the sexual act is the seal of the covenant of marriage between one man and one woman only, and anything, regardless of what it is, outside of that is sinful and does not lead us to union with God, and we cannot condone it. Sadly, they think that means because we condemn homosexual acts, for example, that we're condemning homosexuals. And some of the different groups in the world have done a good job telling us that. The abortion groups telling us if we're against abortion, we hate women. Well, of course not. We love women. We also love a child in the womb. It's like, I love you. I care if you have an unwanted pregnancy, but killing the baby is not the answer. Let's find other, better solutions to your unwanted pregnancy. So hopefully getting people of good intent to listen to that. And some people won't. Some people shut you down completely, and we're probably never going to win them over. Until we start flying, the gay pride flag in the church, they won't come near us. Well, we're not going to do that. So, we just have to let them go. They're not ready to follow the Lord yet. So some of it means talking. Again, one of them that is probably the only one that we would say guilty as charged is people who were upset by the sexual abuse scandal. And we have to wear egg on our face over that one. But it might be helpful to remind them that even last summer, the Pennsylvania grand jury report that came out, what most people didn't realize was that the majority of those cases took place in the 80s and 90s. There had been very, very few reported credible cases of sexual misconduct of a priest with a minor since 2002 and the Dallas Charter. The bishops took it seriously then. There's still some, what's the word I'm looking for? Not plunging. There's still some purging going on. We're still going to be having more stories come out as diocese after diocese maybe goes through this. And we're going to hear about things that happened back in the 70s, 80s, and 90s when things peaked. And we'll still be embarrassed by that. But let's look carefully and remind people, look at the time frame when these things happened. They're by and large not happening now. The biggest case of all, of course, the one that people are most upset, myself included, I'd be the first one on the bandwagon with this one, is the horrible situation that happened with Cardinal McCarrick. That all these other bishops knew he was abusing the seminarians, knew the seminarians could not report him to anyone because they'd never get ordained. And so he had a power over them that if you report me, I won't ordain you. He knew that was happening, and yet they let him go on and be and advance as a bishop and ultimately cardinal when they knew his behavior. And that is absolutely unfathomable in my mind. I said, how somebody in good conscience could do that. But there's been a call even from among the bishops to purge their own numbers of anyone who knew about it, and asking the Vatican to have an independent council to step in and say, find out what bishops knew what and said nothing and turned their way. And if they did, they have to step down. And that's been moving in that direction. So, that's hope-filled on the horizon, that maybe that will be something we can put in the past. And oddly enough, the young people many of them don't know about the sexual scandals. They didn't live through it because everything broke in 2002. And Many of the people today, like a 19-year-old today was born in 2000, was 2 years old when the whole thing broke and everything started to stop of the sexual abuse stuff. So adults talking about it, yeah, but the young people, it's not on their radar. Eventually they will end up picking it up as they get older and hear the stories about it. But then the hardest one to reach are the people who have reasons why they are not following God and not worshiping. And that can be the most difficult group of all to reach. Those are the people who are angry at God for one reason or another. And we have to start looking at, when we listen to them, what's really going on and not what they're telling us. Don't use the excuse, but use the symptom. On a church at large, as I've been saying, we've been doing that for so long, people complaining, oh, the homilies are boring, and the priests are boring, and the music is boring, and I don't like this, and I don't like that. And those are the excuses they're often using. And I think the mistake we've been making as an institution is responding to those and saying, well, if we just get the priests to preach better, and we just get better music in church, everybody will come back. Now, I'm not against, by any means, of course, priests preaching to the best of their ability and making sure the music and the lectors and everything is as prayerful as possible. The liturgy deserves that. But let's not delude ourselves into thinking as long as we have good preaching, everybody's going to come back. Because even parishes where people say, oh, my pastor, my priest is a fantastic preacher, we love his homilies, they're still not packing the doors in. We have to look at what's really underneath. And one of the things that drove it home to me years ago, I remember reading an article in, I believe it was Catholic Digest, where they were talking to people asking them why they left the church. And this one woman said, this is the reason she left the church. Their priest never polished his shoes. And she kept asking him week after week, please, Father, polish your shoes. And he didn't. So she stopped coming to church. And of course, I remember the first time I used that in a homily as a joke, I get all these people who were dropping me off, tins of shoe polish, saying, Father, make sure you polish your shoes. But that's the excuse the person gave. As they pressed it further, she said, if God is so loving, why did he give me a child with Down syndrome? There's the real issue. So the solution to that is not to go around and make sure all priests have shoe polish, but to sit with one by one with each person and say, okay, why do you feel that way? How many people say, I'm angry at God? That is the biggest obstacle to faith on many people, is that they're angry at God, and for a variety of reasons. They lost a loved one, or something bad happened to somebody. And that's part of the beast that we're dealing with throughout 2,000 years, and even before that, the book of Job is an attempt to explain that and say, why does God allow good things to happen or bad things to happen to good people? And I try to remind people all along that, remember, God is not evil. God cannot do something evil to someone. God is all goodness. And sit them down and talk one by one with them. Maybe there you might need some extra help to say, hey, call a priest in or whatever to do so. And if you find yourself in a situation like that, don't pretend to know their answers. Don't say, I can answer your question. In fact, I often say, listen, I don't know what to say to you, but I know this. I know the peace that Christ has given me in my life. When I had crises, when I had problems, I prayed, I spoke, and I found a peace and a way to deal with it. Why don't you do the same? That's probably the best thing we can do to bear witness to Christ on the one-on-one with person. Address what's really bothering them. That we could talk for hours upon hours of every single possible scenario, but this short amount of time we have this evening, which I've already taken too much of, is just a reminder to that there are needs out there. Don't be afraid of it. Don't think you don't have what it takes. What we need to win people over is for them to realize we have a firm commitment to Christ in our life, that we are following him as a church in general, as an individuals, and they might even come to us on their own and say, listen, I know you've had so many problems in your life and yet you still worship and you're at peace. Can you help me? I want the peace you have. They see that, hopefully we'll be able to bring them to Christ. Any questions from you? Comments, observances, anything? Freddie?
Well, you going back to what you were saying earlier in the talk, talking about being bold for Christ and stuff like that. That made me think of at Christ Life, Catherine, who passed away a few years ago. I remember when I first met her. She always used to, when she came to Christ Life and being on the team, I would hear her say, "Be bold in Christ" at every session. When we were praying or whatever. And at first, it was a little different. But I slowly started to understand why she did that, and then hearing the talk tonight kind of really Hounds at Home. And ever since she passed, we've kind of taken that line that she always used to say in her prayers, and whenever she would speak in front of the room, be bold in Christ. We've used that to share that same message with guests ever since then. It started with the little bracelets that we made, which I still have a ton of at home if anybody wants any. But also, just to other people, that we always say that, especially as we get to sharing Christ and talking about going out and evangelizing and talking to people about the faith. Be bold in Christ. Don't be afraid. You need to wear his colors with pride, so to speak. Don't be afraid to say, this is what I believe, and I'm bold for Christ. So that just kind of reminded me of that, and that's a good way of sharing his message.
Yeah, and the guidance that I would always give somebody with that is there's a good way and a bad way to be bold for Christ. Sadly, too many people in the past have gone out with a hammer of orthodoxy and just bashed people over the head and basically told them, if you don't follow everything the church teaches, you're going to hell, and come back to me when you're following everything. Well, that's going to turn all that's going to do is turn people away. That's not bringing them to Christ. We want to make sure that whatever we're saying and doing is bringing them to Christ. The proper boldness comes in when we say, don't be afraid of saying something that somebody may not like at the moment if they have to hear it. Say it charitably, but if you know they need that, present it to them. A perfect example, from anything, if you pour salt in an open wound, what's the first thing that happens? It hurts. And you do that, and somebody will get angry at you. You made my wound hurt more. Get away from me. But then what happens? As the salt sinks in, it starts to heal, and then and the pain goes away, and then the healing begins, and the person realizes you did them a benefit, a blessing by doing that. So sometimes maybe we have to say something to someone we know they don't want to hear, but we have to tell them, and they may, sure enough, be angry, but then later they might say, thank you. I appreciate you doing that. Some of you remember the story I told about my 6th grade teacher a couple of homilies ago about, she told my parents about my behavior in school was not good, and I had to change if I was going to mature, and I didn't want to hear it at the time. But later I realized that it helped me, and I actually sought her out and thanked her. I said, you by being tough with my parents and telling them he's got to stop this, you helped me grow up at a time when I needed it, and you made me a better person. So sometimes that's what it means to be bold. Yes?
Pope Francis, I think, mentioned the possibility of changing the Lord's Prayer.
Okay.
Lead us not into temptation.
To read it to, yeah.
Because God would never lead us to
right.
temptation.
It's a bad, the English translation is a bad translation of the Latin. It should be more on the order of, do not let us fall in temptation. When we're being tempted, do not let us fall. Strengthen us at the time of temptation. I read that just yesterday on somewhere that he's considering that.
He's considering it. I just want to say one thing. In a place like New York, where in Manhattan there's so many brands of Catholicism, where you can go to like ultra liberal Catholic churches where if the gay flag's not flying, it's pretty close.
Yeah. Oh, I know one for specifically that drapes the altar with the gay pride flag and has a gay mass.
And this is Catholic Church.
Yeah, it's run by a religious order, so the cardinal has only certain things he can do with it.
But then for us, the message is mixed.
Exactly. Yeah. That's the problem. Because people say, well, you say it's right, and you say it's wrong. Well, what's the truth? That's actually another homily I had 2 weeks ago where I said that the certitude, when people are disagreeing as to what the truth is, who ultimately is the authority that tells us that the final voice to say this is the truth? And that is the Bishop of Rome, because Jesus gave that authority to St. Peter and his successor. To you I give the keys to the kingdom of heaven. What you permit on earth shall be permitted in heaven, and what you forbid on earth shall be forbidden in heaven. So when the church comes out with a clear and consistent teaching, I know it's the absolute truth, because it's come from the ultimate authority, and the Lord promised he would never let them make the church sustain a faulty teaching or a lie. So those who are going out, since the church has been absolutely clear about homosexual acts are gravely sinful, Anybody who's teaching people otherwise are not leading them to Christ. They're leading them to themselves. They're making them love them as we're the hero. I know. Oh, I know. Catholic churches that do that, and I know brother priests who've done that. I said, but you know what? They're making, whether you realize it or not, they're making them love you because you're making me feel good. You're reinforcing me. You're reaffirming me. All the things that we hear. You have compassion on my needs. You understand me. You're sympathetic. You're all of that, but you know what? It's all about them. Father, you. It's not Christ. They're bringing them to me, not to Christ. And my job is to lead people to Christ, not to lead them to me. And to lead them to Christ even if they hate me. Even if they absolutely, if somehow there could be a situation where they said, I absolutely despise Father Carrozza, but through what he told me, I found Christ. I don't know how that could happen, but if you could imagine that I have to be accepting that and say, fine, they're not here to love me, they're here to love Christ. And that's part of being bold, is being willing to be unliked by people just to tell them the truth, which we know we're going to get.
Sometimes I think, and I don't know how the Eucharist is administered.
Mm-hmm.
Some of these parishes that Pat mentioned, how do we know within a mixed message? I'm just saying, I'm being as open as possible here, because I know where I stand with this. How do we know? It's like, is it false pastoral outreach, would you say, to present a mass just to get people in there? Are they being denied Eucharist? My point is it leading to like these conversions? You have the group Courage.
Courage is a different story, yes.
Yeah.
Courage is helping people with same-sex attraction deal with it and live a chaste life.
Right.
Which the other thing I try to remind people is you don't need to have sexual activity in order to be happy. If sex were the key to happiness, New York would be Shangri-La. Because there's nothing sexual you can't find in New York. Yes, but you can live without a romantic relationship and sexual activity and be very happy and fulfilled.
Well,
Trust me, I know what I'm talking about. Believe me, I know what I'm talking about.
I think that's a difficult thing, like what Pat was saying, like you're in the belly of the beast there.
Yep.
The only sanctuary is the Catholic Church, and then
Right.
you go in there and you're like, hey, what's going on here? There's a
Okay.
rainbow flag.
Yep. It's definitely confusing. Now, the one thing to remember is the Eucharist is the Eucharist, and it's not tainted because of that. I mean, the priest who does that has a lot to answer for before the Lord. But even a priest in mortal sin, if he's a validly ordained priest, is still offering the Eucharist, and you're still receiving the body and blood of Christ for your own forgiveness and for your own connection with Christ on the cross, even if the priest doesn't realize that he's encouraging things that are things Jesus died to forgive. Yes, Pat.
You mentioned the scandal. My feeling is a little bit different in that I believe that subcultures are all around us.
Yes.
And I believe that there was a subculture of the gay priests, and they all know each other.
Oh, absolutely.
Every single one.
Oh, no question. Yes.
What I'm saying is, they all know each other, and then it's like they're never going to give each other up. That's just the kind
That
of
too,
way.
of course. Sure.
And moving forward, the idea of priests marrying, it's going to happen.
Well,
And
it could.
I think it's going to happen, and I think the talent pool for talent, for the best Catholics, the best people, is in the biggest talent pool. Where it's like, who wants to be a priest? And it's going to be married men, it's going to be men. In today's world, with the internet, everybody's calling BS. If there's BS, people are calling it.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like, when we talk about like the 70s or the 80s or the
Right.
90s, when these things happen, people didn't have a voice. Today, everyone's calling BS on everything.
Mm-hmm.
So it's so hard to live an authentic, great, good life.
Okay. Well, there's two approaches to that. One, celibacy is a discipline of the church. The Pope does have the authority to relax it if he wanted to. And if he does, and he said if he made it optional and priests could have the right to get married, he does have the authority to do that because it's only a discipline of the church. But if anybody thinks it's going to be the solution to the sexual abuse problem and the shortage of vocations, no. Because number one, priests who were having sex with each other or abusing children, greater than 90% of the sexual abuse of priests toward children was of boys. So they weren't abusing them because they were priests. They were abusing them because they were gay. And so allowing priests to marry women is not going to do anything about gay priests. So, secondly, also Protestants, Eastern Rite Catholics, Orthodox, Jews, they all allow their ministers to marry, and they're having shortages too. So celibacy is not the cause of any of the problems, and I think anybody who thinks if we just allow priests to get married, all of this is going to change. Blaming celibacy for sexual abuse is like blaming marriage for infidelity. It's not the person who's keeping the promise, but the person who's not keeping it that's causing it. So there could be good reasons to talk about allowing priests to marry, but I don't think those are the proper reasons to look at that.
I was in Mount St. Michael in the early 80s, and we had Father Bernard Lynch, and he was gay, and he ended up leaving the church, marrying a man. He's married to a man now, and the thing that's crazy is, like, my experience with him was not that he was bad, but he was distracted even then. His distraction, like, he never touched me, but he's suspect. He's suspect, and but his distraction affected all of us.
Oh, sure.
So now it's like,
Absolutely.
He's got an agenda, and then sure enough, he becomes like he carried the flag, the gay thing, and then for me, like, we had a reunion, a 35-year reunion where we go back, and then there's people that drink the Kool-Aid like it never happened.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's kind of like it's
part
I
of
think the same. I think that it's important, though, to honestly talk. Like in my parish in Rockland, we had one priest who was, he's Father Rose. You probably, I know another priest that was in the same seminary class as them, and let's put it this way: there was the rumors were around the parish that he was buying whiskey and showing pornography in the rectory, and I always had a fear that he was no good, and to the point when I was an altar boy, I used to, after serving mass, I would take my cassock off and throw it and just run out.
Right.
Afraid of being attacked. And that's a trauma.
Oh,
I
sure.
was never attacked. That's a trauma that spread through a lot of males who were doing this ministry, and I know we spoke about this thing before, but the reason important to this ministry is that there is kind of a running joke that people are afraid of priests. Not you or
no, I know what you mean.
But there is a general consensus that the priesthood is not the trusting father.
Oh yeah, it's been very much damaged by what happened. Yes, definitely.
It's a hard one because it is witness to Christ. Part of it's apologetics.
Right, and that's where you have to call people to say, all right, yes, what some priests did was horrible, but don't assume every priest is doing it. The vast majority of priests were not doing it.
It was Mount St. Michael.
Yeah.
It was the school. It's like they didn't know, like they knew.
Or they'd look the other way.
Time out.
And
No, they didn't look the other way. They celebrated it at that time.
okay, yeah, there's also a lot of that.
At that time, it was like they were here and we were here, and he was the only priest.
Right.
So his brothers, and then he's the priest, right? And that's like, especially for the kids that got expelled.
Yeah.
And for there was a lot
Well,
of times
yeah.
where it wasn't Boys Town.
Yeah.
With Spencer Tracy.
Yeah, no, there were a lot of bad response to that. Yes, some of the places where it was celebrated,
My uncle's a priest.
others
My
were,
brother's a priest.
yeah, others
So-
where they looked the other way, because for a longest while, one of the things that I still personally think some of the bishops are afraid to be strong and to take necessary steps to clearly condemn certain activity and say, maybe excommunicating people. Sometimes perhaps it has to happen. When it came, especially with the sexual stuff and the sexual revolution, and the bishops, the last thing they wanted to seem was to be authoritarian, as everybody was trying to accuse them of being. The Pope and the bishops are just trying to find out what we enjoy to say, you can't do that, like they're just trying to ruin our fun. And so they were afraid, hesitant to give the strong guidance and say, no, that's a sin. And we're paying the price for it now. Because when they knew it was happening, they say, oh, well.
I'll just tell you one great story. And my uncle's a priest from Ireland. And when he first came out from Ireland, he was assigned to Staten Island. And the bell rang at like 11 o'clock at night at the rectory. And he went and he answered the door in his T-shirt. And it was somebody was sick. And then he ended up getting dressed and going to do the left, right. And then he was chastened by his superior, who said, never answer the door to the rectory unless you have your collar. And he said, yeah, and he said, he goes, but it was an emergent. He goes, let them wait. And he was setting a clear boundary. And he said, like, boundaries is where the real problem is. Where the boundaries of where, you know, like locker rooms, you know, places where you never belong, ever. Where people of that age, that's for them.
Yep.
I don't belong there. You know,
Absolutely.
and the boundaries, I really think got really and they still get mishmashed. And it's scary.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, the other point though, I want to make, it's very scary. Sorry. go ahead.
yeah, no, that's
Yeah.
okay.
The other point though I want to make though, despite all of the, you know, the tainting of the priesthood, whatever, a lot of ways I don't think, I'm not a fan of the priests getting married, and I'll give you a couple of reasons why. Priests are, you know, if a priest has children, and he's I have a 2-year-old at home, my wife, and my whole world is owned by my son. Like, I have no time for Knights of Columbus, everything else in my life. It's like, if I can get out, you know, luckily Bob's daughter is watching James right now because Anne's at a retreat, and I just personally do not see a married man being a priest. I don't effectively. I tell you why. The unfairness that they say the Jews, the Protestants, and Eastern Orthodox, that's something they don't have. They don't have daily mass. The Eastern Orthodox don't have daily mass like the Catholic Church does. Their sacramental, the weight of sacramental output, their sacramental life in the Catholic Church is the richest. Now they're apostolic in the Orthodox Church. So people say, oh, you have college, he's a college, same thing. But they don't have the daily mass requirement. They don't have the rigidity. And there's also other things. There's hospital visits, last rites, whatever. I just don't see. I have a 2-year-old at home with 1 child, and he's not even in Little League yet. You imagine having 3 or 4 kids. What are you going to drop what you're doing? You're going to give last rites. I just don't see it happening. Me personally, and I think also too we have to really keep our eye on the supernatural prize that the original New Testament writers were celibate, and St. Paul had talked about celibacy being superior.
Even Jesus did too.
And Jesus was a celibate man. He was true God and true man. And to the point, I've had guys who I know a friend that was in seminary. And he says, "Oh, it'd be the greatest things." I know guys who would be working Wall Street, talented guys, and they'd be burned out. Well, I said, I don't think a backup option is any person that is deserving of the role of the apostolic role. I know it seems like a palatable thing, and fathers would be priests because fathers are fathers. But I think it's short-sighted. I really think it's short-sighted, and there are Anglican priests that become Catholic priests and bring the kids over.
But they're not working in parishes. They give
No,
them
they're
administrative
not.
jobs
Yeah,
because they know you can't do it in a parish.
Yeah,
I don't know
exactly.
where
I
I
don't
would
see
find
that.
the time to have a family.
I don't see
On
that.
top of that, I don't have enough time to
Even
do my
guys
job
that
as a
are married,
pastor.
There's a guy that's married that I know, he has 3 children. He goes, oh, it'd be the greatest thing. But I said, would you become a priest? Oh, no, I wouldn't do it.
Yeah.
You know, it's like, because I just think it's a real, and we know priests, we know Father Fitzgerald, we know Father Morrow, Father Gillespie. They're tremendously, there's also the priest that we talked about.
I love priests.
Yeah, no,
I
no,
love.
no, but
I'm
Yeah.
here.
I like
and
the
I love.
priests.
And Talentine saved
I like
my
the
life.
priests
I
to
went
go
from
on.
Mount to Talentine.
When I go into
Yeah.
confession, we talked about this before, you go to confession, and you know this jump into the priest. There's just something reassuring, seal of confession, that he's going into the bed alone. There's just
Yeah.
something with it. I'm just,
You kn-
like
And you know what I find the
I
most
just
practical
think
thing?
And he's meditating, the priest that goes to confession, not the seal of it is the seal, but he's reflecting on the different lifestyles.
Yep.
You know, I don't know, I think celibacy, and St. Paul talks about it, it's a supreme way of living. I'm going to stick with the apostolic tradition and
Right.
with the test was, St. James, St. Paul, all of them were celibate. St. Peter wasn't, he was married.
Well, actually, according to tradition, the only apostle who wasn't married was John. St. John the Evangelist was single, but the others were all married,
Oh,
according
they were,
to
okay.
according to tradition. Yeah,
St. Paul was.
Paul was not, but Paul wasn't one of the 12.
Oh,
The
okay,
12
right,
apostles,
gotcha.
yeah.
Okay, so
Right.
there's a reason why, but I just, don't, it's my thing, I'm talking about St. Paul, whatever. But personally, I just don't see it realistically, and we gotta remember, maybe you have to go back to the Acts of the Apostles. What were the communities smaller? Was it different? But we're looking at the modern lens. I just think.
Well, yeah. Well, just
Yeah.
Well,
I don't know, I just don't see.
just to summarize it.
The thing about the church is that the church isn't just looking at today.
Yeah.
The church is just looking at whatever decisions
Universal.
we make, how it's going to have an impact on society 200 years from now.
Mhm.
You know what I mean? That we look beyond just what's going on in the modern day.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think also too, I don't think fatherhood in the priesthood is the only thing that's been corrupted. I think marriage in general has been.
Oh, half of marriages are running in
Yeah,
divorce.
it's like, I don't know.
Yeah.
I think that's an important. I think it's an important discourse though,
Mhm.
in the church.
Right.
Not saying-
No, I mean, I think
Yeah.
it's up
Well,
to
that's-
the
I'm not even
There are
saying-
good discussions that can be had about
Yeah.
it, but yeah, I think first of
There are
all,
married priests.
yeah, I know
Yeah.
there are some situations here, but you know who's the one group who's not screaming about needing for priests to get married? The priests themselves. We're not asking. I remember when I was newly ordained.
There's no priest.
Well, I remember when I was newly ordained, I went and did a friend's wedding, and somebody said, "He goes, thank you, Father, it was beautiful, and don't worry, we're working very hard to get you to get the right to get married." I said, "Thank you. Who asked you? I like my life. In fact, if the Pope should give us the right to get married, I still would remain celibate." You have to live it to understand the beauty of celibacy, that we're living now the way Christ lived and the way we'll live in heaven, and I can devote myself to my parish. You are my family. You are my children. So I can do that, which I would be divided if I had also my own wife and kids. But the most practical thing that usually gets people to abandon the idea is I tell them, well, if we did have married priests, then you'd all have to be giving a minimum of $500 a week in the collection. Because first of all, I'm going to get married and have 6 kids, and I'm traditional. My wife doesn't go out to work. She stays home and raises the kids, and they all go to private school. So you have to pay for all the money from my house and my wife and my kids. And Father James will get married and have kids, and so you have to do the same for him. And do you see my wife and Father James' wife living together in the same house? No way. So you're going to have 2 separate rectories for us. So you have to provide all of that. So it's going to be minimum of $500 at least per week for everybody if you're going to have that. That's usually when people say, all right, forget the married priests.
Well, I mean, it's unless it's an act of love, it really is appealing to our lower nature, sexual act.
Well, and at this point, I think the arguments that people are using for removing celibacy in the priesthood are not positive reasons, but negative ones. They're saying, oh, priests can't do it, and it's just not the truth. It's not where it is.
Father, I just wanted to ask you, I was listening on Relevant Radio yesterday, the Patrick Madrid show, and people were calling up about these, what do you call them, he just alluded to it in the libraries.
Oh, yeah, the drag queen
Drag
story
queens.
hours, yeah.
I mean, and he made the comment that this is like, all right, they got the gay marriage thing approved, through the law thing, but now this is almost like rubbing it in our nose.
Absolutely.
You know?
And they're also even trying,
Ridiculous.
it's not just, it's gone to far more than toleration, because there's no toleration for us. They don't want the right to marry whether you're straight or single. They also want everybody in America to accept them and say, you must say my marriage is right. And that's why they've been trying me. They've actually had cases where ministers and priests who have stood up in the pulpit and preached that homosexual acts are sinful, they want them arrested for hate speech. Where's toleration for our religious rights and my freedom of speech? The First Amendment clearly gives us that.
Father, a lot of people feel that we're like right before the Civil War because the lines are actually getting.
Yep.
It's getting because a lot of people who don't approve of this stuff
Yeah.
like
Exactly.
We've been quiet.
And we're seeing it in politics.
Yeah, now we're getting our noses rubbed
Yep.
in all the time.
Notice what's happening in the last election and the upcoming election already. Now you see the Democrats it's becoming more and more the socialist bend. So we've got a moderate Republican versus the socialists. Trump is not even a reactionary. You're not even getting issues. You're getting a moderate Republican and socialism. One of the candidates for president in California was talking a thing recently where he says, I have to caution the Democratic Party that pressing socialism is not the answer of how to beat Trump. And they booed him.
Right.
They're pushing socialism now. So, yeah, we are getting like that. We have a cultural war going on. It's not going to be settled with guns. I don't know how it's going to settle, but we do have a war coming our way.
Some people say when Pope Francis made a comment about gays, who am I to judge?
Oh, that was the most mistake thing, the worst example of fake news and somebody misquoting someone. It was coming back from World Youth Day in Rio de Janeiro. A reporter asked him a question. We don't even know what the question was. We can guess from the question that the person asked, is somebody who performs a homosexual act going to hell? That sounds like probably what the question was. And he says, well, he goes, if somebody is gay and he's trying his best to follow the Lord, who am I to judge him? From that, the news started claiming that Pope Francis allowed gay marriage and said that homosexual acts are okay. And I had somebody here when Anthony Felicissimo got up and talked about how for the first time Yonkers was going to fly the gay pride flag. He got Anthony at the back and then he called me and he goes, the Pope approved of gay marriage. I said, where did the Pope approve of gay marriage? He goes, he said, and I quote, who am I to judge? I said, boy, did you get that wrong. And so then he got on to, it turns out his nephew was gay, and sometimes, unfortunately, people, when they discover that, the only thing they can end up doing, the only way they can deal with a relative who is doing something sinful is start saying, well, I guess the church is wrong, and now I have to fight for his rights. All right, how about, your nephew steals a car? You still want to love him. Are you going to say that stealing is now okay because he's gotten into a life of stealing? Or drugs? Well, they should legalize drugs so that my nephew is not a sinner. It's the same thing. They don't understand that you can tell them, all right, I know you did nothing to cause this same-sex attraction, but if you cannot enter into the covenant of marriage, then you must live a celibate, chaste life like anyone else, even perfectly straight people who just never meet the right person to marry. Sex is not a right, and that's the problem in our world today. Too many people think we have a right to sex, and it's not a right. It's a gift from God to marriage. And I say, if, people are out, people who keep thinking, sex is the key to happiness and everything, well, then it's all over the place. So why are we still so miserable? And why are the happiest people in the world, according to every survey that's ever taken, the people in the world who are happiest in their life and happiest in their occupation are Catholic priests? Why? It just bucks all the odds, all the stuff out there. But they just don't want to give it up. They don't want to let go. They can't let go of that idea, I have to have my sexual acts. Why? I don't have them and I'm happy.
It also has to be a way, I was funny because I was coming home, I got a ride home, I went to the train at work yesterday, we had a conference in Midtown, and I was getting a ride home from two of my colleagues, and the drag queen story hour came up, and it co-opted the whole conversation home, and they're not very religious, they go to, maybe they go to church, whatever, I don't know, they're both Catholic. But it was amazing to me, how, even when I was talking about this with them, it co-opted the very witness to Christ. A lot of things I'd rather be talking about in the car.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes there's a danger too of sort of being scandalized, you don't even know it. And I think when you have these things like gay marriage and drag queen hour, I think there needs to be a stance, but I think there has to be, we gotta move on and really understand what.
Or to move that into a Christ dimension, which fits in with the topic tonight.
Yeah.
But somebody's saying, okay, so you're saying you have a man who really thinks he's a woman. He's a man in a woman's body or vice versa. Are you trying to say God made a mistake? That when God created that child, he goes, oh, I was supposed to make that a boy and I made it a girl. Oh, well, thankfully, once they come of age, they'll realize my mistake and correct it. Yeah, come on. And they bring it around that way to them. As well as just on the whole discussion of that, when the libraries say, oh, everybody, we don't censor anyone. Everybody has a right to the time in the library. Really? So we're going to bring in a bunch of skinheads to teach kids? You're going to have a skinhead story hour? Now, I'm not equating drag queens with skinheads, but there is a line of censorship. We certainly say certain things we will not tolerate being taught to children. I think gender fluidity is certainly something you do not teach to children, because it's psychological child abuse. 40% of transgender individuals attempt suicide. Who in his right mind would want to try to encourage a child from an early age to go down a path where 40% commit suicide or attempt suicide? And it's not going to change when more people do it. It's because I'm convinced it's because they think this is the answer. I'm really a woman in a man's body. So I'll just become a woman. I change the body and everything, have these surgeries and pass myself off as a woman, and they're still not finding the happiness. It didn't work, and they don't know where to turn.
But if they're only 2% of the whole population,
If even that. If even that.
and look, it's being ran down our throats.
Yeah,
Where do we go?
and even the vast majority of people who are gay are not transsexual. You know, there's lots of gay men who don't want to become women, yeah, and women, same thing. But it is. It's being shoved, and we're buying it because of toleration. And we don't want to be condemning anybody or anything like that. So we're buying into it.
Yeah, they got the money.
Yeah.
They got the money.
Well, that's it. And they have the political influence, too. And the political
Can't
influence,
open
too.
your mouth if you got a supervisor at work. I have a supervisor.
No, I know.
Huh?
Yeah.
Can't open your mouth.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Especially city job, you're finished.
Not only that, they talk
Right.
openly about it. Pop, 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 and if you say one word,
Right.
huh?
Oh, use it.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, it's getting late, gentlemen. So
Yeah.
maybe we want to get home to our wives and children and
Yeah.
TVs
In bed.
and bed.
That's where I'm going.